Hello, everyone. We're here talking about autism spectrum disorders. And I'm just going to let you know that it is a little bit long. There's some videos to break things up, but we're just going to go for it. So, autism spectrum disorders, let me move Jennifer, is a neurodevelopmental disorder that really, they don't know what causes it, although they have evidence, scientists have evidence to suggest that there's possibly a combination of environmental and genetic factors. There is no blood test, there is no brain test. It is, again, a behaviorally defined disorder based on specific criteria that have been specified. And those criteria have changed over time. So in terms of, okay, yep, here we go. In terms of how many people or children are diagnosed with autism, prevalence is considered the number of cases of a condition that exists at a particular time for a defined population. And so the Centers for Disease Control every few years does this evaluation of autism prevalence. Now, they don't capture every single case across every state. They select representative states and they go through different processes to try to estimate the prevalence. So right now, as of 2014, and that's the most recent data, 1 in 59 children have been identified with autism spectrum disorder. It's reported in all racial, socioeconomic, and ethnic and linguistic groups. The prevalence, it's in all continents, and it's more common in boys than it is in girls. And the prevalence varies by countries. So why the increase in prevalence? Well, there's a lot of potential reasons, again, not necessarily clear, but it could be because there's different strategies for how prevalence is determined. So for example, prevalence can be determined in different ways, such as looking at data from from medical records and educational records that are collected within a particular state, health or school records, but a lot of times this could underestimate prevalence because those who haven't yet come to a clinic or a medical facility or haven't received an educational diagnosis wouldn't be counted. And we also know that there are systemic inequities in terms of access to diagnosis and treatment. So if healthcare access is inconsistent for different racial and cultural groups, then you're going to have a difference in prevalence that's not necessarily accurately estimating prevalence for all groups. But we do know that over time, the number of cases of individuals, children identified with autism has changed and has increased significantly over time, from 0.5 children per 1,000 to in the 60s and 70s to 15 to 17 children per 1,000. And it continues to increase. So other potential factors might be related to how we define it. So I mentioned that there were changes to the diagnostic criteria that broadened the criteria. That might actually mean that more children qualify for a diagnosis than before. There's been a huge push and increase to try to increase awareness about autism spectrum disorders in various communities to try to address the gap in diagnosis and access for racial minorities in particular and for socioeconomic minorities in particular. So that could be underlying an increase in prevalence. I mentioned before last week in our behavioral disorders PowerPoint about differential diagnosis. And so this last bullet talks about how children with an intellectual disability wouldn't necessarily be able to qualify for an autism disability. And the evidence suggests that about half of children with autism will have some kind of intellectual disability as well too. So now that children can be identified with multiple developmental disorders, that can also increase the percentage of children identified with autism. So again, I mentioned before that more girls are identified with autism than boys. One girl to every 4 boys. And in terms of race, I think the difference in identification across racial categories overall, this is the autism prevalence by race across all the sites that were estimated in 2014. So you can see there is a different closing gap in the identification rates. So whites are identified at higher rates, but the gap between white and non-Hispanic, Black, Hispanic, and Asian Pacific Islander is closing overall, but the data varies by state, okay? Because states have different diagnostic criteria that they work with. States have different issues or opportunities or challenges with the diagnostic process and access for different groups to the diagnostic and treatment process. So when you look at Wisconsin, so remember I said the prevalence across all the sites across the nation that participated in the 2014 estimate, it was 1 in 59 children. While it's a lower prevalence rate in Wisconsin, 1 in 71 children. Still, boys are more likely to be identified than girls. White children are more likely to be identified than Black or Hispanic children. And there is still a persistent, even though we can diagnose autism early as 2 years old, definitively, we still have children being diagnosed after 4 years old. And when you look at racial disparities in diagnosis, a lot of Black and Hispanic children are being diagnosed at older ages. And this is really problematic because they don't have access to early intervention, intensive early intervention that really can have a positive impact on children's life outcomes. And there's a host of services that occur between 0 to 3 years old that if you're identified at 4 years old, you just don't have access to. So it's really, really problematic. And that's something that I think there's increasing awareness and hopefully outreach and trying to close the gap. Well, here's another visual that shows the disparity in prevalence across racial categories. It's decreasing over time, which is a good trend. Just like overall across the nation sites, it's decreasing over time, but there's still a much wider gap here than there is across all the sites combined. So lots of ideas about what causes autism. We really, again, don't know, but there's historically lots of ideas. One idea had to do with, and this is kind of tied to families being considered upper class, highly educated families as being the only kinds of families that could have autism show up. But there was also this concept of refrigerator mothers. And I'm going to show you a brief video. So let me go to my, let me go to my refrigerator mothers here. Nope, that's not it, is it? Okay. I won't play the whole video, and I'll upload the PowerPoint so that you can watch the whole video, because I don't want the lectures to be too long. Hey, Jennifer, can you mute yourself?
Oh, I thought I was muted. I apologize.
No problem.
Liz, letting you know on this video, I am seeing captions and I do not hear sound.
You don't hear sound? Okay.
Correct.
I hear sound, so I'm hoping it comes through in the overall video. Sorry, guys, we're working these technology glitches out, so. Okay. I am hoping that you guys were able to both read the captions and hear. So we are going to watch the video back and see if that was the case. And if not, if you weren't able to hear, but you still were able to read the captions, great. And if not, you can always go back and look at the YouTube link as well. So another potential cause, as the thinking evolved, is people started moving away from thinking that it was poor parenting and started trying to look at biological factors. And then not considering autism to be an emotional disorder, but one, or a psychological disorder, but one caused by some underlying biological factors. And but we still don't have a lot of information around the neurobiology of autism. There are what we call functional MRI studies that look at the brains of people who have been diagnosed with autism and the brains of neurotypical folks. And, you know, they examine the brains while they're doing different activities to see if there's different aspects of the brain that are kind of engaged. And there have been studies that have found different parts of the brain are engaged in different, people with autism versus people without. So for example, patterns showing that the visual cortex is more engaged, more highly engaged than the temporal cortex. So language, the visual cortex is more engaged in people with autism than the language cortex when doing an activity that's more verbal. So there's some studies trying to document the neurobiology of autism, but it's still not solid evidence. And there also, again, just looking at the disparities in diagnosis and access to diagnosis, there's a persistent race and class bias in diagnosis. I'm going to show you this brief video. Okay. Other causes, and this is where there's been lots of controversial thinking about environmental factors interacting with genetic factors. There was a time where people thought that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine was responsible for causing autism. And I'm not going to play this video, but you can watch it. But basically that whole thinking led to many families refusing to give their children the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, which is highly problematic because these are diseases that could be prevented through vaccination, and that there's, I don't know if you heard of an outbreak of measles in New York in a community, a religious community that didn't believe in vaccination. And it was, you know, highly problematic because the diseases were coming back because of parental decision making around vaccination. But the science was based on a doctor who actually falsified his results of his studies. And so it was totally debunked. So you can watch the video about that. So there's a lot of evidence, like I said before, to substantiate that genetics may be underlying autism. So when they've done studies with identical twins, if one twin has autism, the other twin is much more likely to have it compared to fraternal twins. And parents who have a child with autism are more likely to have a second child or other child impacted with autism. You also see that autism occurs in other types of genetic conditions. So for example, 10% of children with autism are also identified as having Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, and other chromosomal or genetic disorders. So what is autism? What does it look like? And really, it's fundamentally based in three areas: social communication, social interaction, and a restricted range or repetitive range of behaviors, interests, or activities. It's got to be present in early developmental periods. So even if somebody receives a diagnosis later in life, they have to be able to have some documentation through medical developmental records or through parent report that there were symptoms that showed up in an early developmental period. And the idea of autism spectrum disorders as an umbrella term has changed. It used to be that there were separate disorders. So for example, I don't know, many of you have heard of Asperger's disorder, which is more individuals who were highly verbal, highly intelligent, but more impacted with their social interaction and social communication and understanding. There was another disorder called Rett disorder, another one, pervasive developmental disorders. All of these are now grouped under this overall umbrella term, autism spectrum disorders. So in terms of identifying different characteristics, so there's communication, differences in communication. Individuals with autism may develop language, may understand language, may be able to speak and produce expressive language, but they may have difficulty with the acquisition of language. They might have difficulty using language to express their needs, their wants, their desires. They might have difficulty with understanding the pragmatics of language, so understanding social rules, how to behave within conversations, how to read the nonverbal and how nonverbal language layers with verbal language. They may have a lot of language, but then use it in a very echolalic, repetitive way. So I long ago, I ended up working in England for a year, and I worked at what we call a sheltered workshop place where it was people with disabilities kind of going to work, but it really wasn't work. It was like busy work. And there was this woman named Zoe with echolalia, and she was only 19, but they had a lot of older people working there as well too. And she loved this store called Quartz, and she would repetitively repeat the jingle from Quartz, but she would do it right next to this one guy who really, really, really was super annoyed by her. So she would strategically start doing the echolalic Quartz, and then repeating the jingle just to piss him off. and then she would run away and laugh. And it was like very, very clear what she was doing. And so she was using language in a very, so I think, socially appropriate but inappropriate way. But anybody looking at it would just see her just kind of repeating herself over and over and over again. So it's just communication shows up differently than in neurotypical folks. So we're looking at social interaction right now. And there's lots of challenges with the social interaction, and some of them are listed here. So developing relationships may be a challenge. Understanding proximity and rules of social space, personal space. Understanding, when you think about language and interaction, a lot of times people say probably 90% of communication is nonverbal. It's through the social rules, it's through how you use your body, it's through kind of what we understand about quote unquote what's appropriate or non-appropriate. Challenges with social interaction can be related to the restricted interests, because if you're always wanting to talk about one particular subject and not talk about anything else, then that can pose difficulties in developing solid relationships with others. Sensory areas is another area that shows up with people with autism who, you know, and I like to use the term neurodiverse, neurotypical versus neurodiverse, rather than saying, you know, we just have neurodiversity. Our brains are different, and people with autism have different brains, and it's not that our brain is a standard brain and people with autism have abnormal brains, right? So the sensory perception of the world can show up differently in terms of being highly sensitive or very not sensitive. And this again is all of our senses involved. So what might that look like? Well, you could see behavioral outbursts related to difficulty processing sensory information, or with just heightened levels of sensitivity to sensory information, or just having a lot of fear around certain situations. And so I just have some, you know, things that I can list. So being extremely irritated with sounds in the environment, like fire alarms or police sirens, or alarm clocks ringing. Being not able to process more than one sound at a time. And if you think about our sensory environment from a hearing standpoint, it's full of lots of different types of sounds. From the visual, being sensitive to have a certain smell. You might see behaviors like waving or flapping their hands in front of their nose, or smelling lots of different things, rubbing things, spinning things. So lots of different ways to interact with the sensory world to either help to stimulate themselves or to calm their sensitivities down. So that's it. And I will follow up with a activity, which I will include on Canvas, that you will do after this lecture. All right, so let me just go ahead and stop sharing and stop recording.